The house had grown silent, but the stillness only made it harder to calm my thoughts. I lay on my bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, each one feeling like a reflection of the fractures within me. The events of the day replayed over and over in my mind. The marketplace, the Leo's mocking laughter, Timothy stepping in like he always did, and the weight of my father's words pressing on my chest. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the window. I turned onto my side, trying to shut it all out, but sleep didn't come. Instead, the insults echoed in my head. Dreg. Useless. You don't belong here. I clenched my fists against the mattress, trying to push the words away, but they stuck to me like burrs. My breath quickened as frustration bubbled up inside me. Why couldn't I just let it go? Why couldn't I be stronger, like Timothy, or even like my father? The sound of the whetstone earlier in the evening came to mind, its sharp rhythm like a metronome for my thoughts. My father always worked with such precision, such purpose. He never doubted himself. He never faltered. I wondered if he had ever felt as lost as I did now. Somehow, I doubted it. I sat up abruptly, the blanket falling away. The room felt suffocating, the air too heavy to breathe. I needed to move, to get out, to escape the thoughts that swirled like a storm in my mind. Slipping out of bed, I moved quietly to avoid waking my parents. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I tiptoed toward the door. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe again. The village was quiet, the streets empty under the pale glow of the moon. I walked aimlessly at first, my feet carrying me toward the outskirts of the village. The sound of the distant river was a low hum in the background, a rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. The marketplace was long behind me now, but its weight lingered. Before I realized where I was heading, I found myself at the cliffs overlooking the valley. The view stretched out before me, the moonlight illuminating the rolling hills and forest below. It was a place I often came to when I needed to think, or when I needed to feel small. The wind tugged at my hair as I stepped closer to the edge, the cool breeze grounding me in the moment. I sat down on a flat rock, my legs dangling over the side, and stared out at the horizon. I replayed Timothy's words in my head, his steady voice cutting through the noise. "You're stronger than you think, Kael. You just don't see it yet." Did he really believe that? Did anyone? I let out a bitter laugh, the sound swallowed by the wind. If I was so strong, why did I feel so powerless? Why did I let others define who I was? The Leo's face flashed in my mind, his sneering expression, and the way his voice dripped with disdain. Dreg. The word felt like a brand, one I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. But as I sat there, staring at the valley, another thought crept in, a quiet, defiant whisper. Why do you care so much? I frowned, the thought catching me off guard. Why did I care what the Leo thought of me? Or anyone else, for that matter? They didn't know me. They didn't know what I was capable of. But then again, did I? I ran a hand through my hair, the frustration boiling over again. I wanted to scream, to shout into the night, to let it all out. But I didn't. Instead, I clenched my fists and breathed deeply, the cool air filling my lungs. There was a part of me, a small, stubborn part, that refused to give up. Maybe it was Timothy's voice in my head. Maybe it was the memory of my father's steady hand on my shoulder. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I hadn't found yet. But for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. The hours passed without me realizing it, the sky growing lighter as dawn approached. The wind had calmed, and the valley below was bathed in the soft, golden light of morning. My thoughts were quieter now, though the weight in my chest hadn't completely lifted as I stood up and dusted myself off. I felt different, if only slightly. The doubts were still there, the fear still lingering at the edges. But there was also a spark, a small, fragile spark that whispered, maybe Timothy's right. Maybe I can be more. I turned back toward the village, the path ahead of me clear and quiet. The day wasn't going to be easy. My father would have expectations. The village would have its whispers. But as I walked, I felt the first stirrings of resolve. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the next step. The first rays of sunlight spilled through my window, casting long shadows across the room. I blinked, my body heavy with exhaustion from the restless night. Despite the fatigue, something about the light felt different. It wasn't just the usual warmth of the morning. It was a quiet reminder that today wasn't yesterday. A clean slate. I sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from my neck. My thoughts lingered on the cliffs, the cool wind, and the flicker of resolve I had felt as dawn approached. It was faint, like a fragile ember, but it was still there. It whispered a single question. What now? The house was still quiet as I shuffled into the hallway. The scent of breakfast wafted through the air, a mix of baked bread and herbs. My mother was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she worked, her presence as steady as the sunrise. I paused for a moment, watching her. Her gentle energy always had a way of grounding me, even when my thoughts were storming. She glanced over her shoulder and smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Kael," she said warmly. "You're up early." I shrugged, trying to sound casual. I couldn't sleep. Her smile faltered slightly, the concern in her eyes surfacing. "Rough night?" I hesitated before nodding. "Something like that." She set down the knife she had been using to slice bread and walked over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was light but firm, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone. "It's a new day," she said softly. "Whatever's weighing on you, you can leave it behind. Focus on what's ahead." I nodded again, though her words felt heavier than they sounded. "What's ahead?" The question lingered as I stepped away and headed to the workshop. My father was already there, as I expected. The rhythmic sound of his tools filled the space, a steady cadence that was both comforting and intimidating. He worked with precision, his hands moving with the kind of confidence that seemed effortless. It was something I had always envied about him. His ability to pour himself into his craft with no hesitation. He didn't look up when I entered, but he spoke after a moment. "Couldn't sleep." I froze for a moment, surprised he had noticed. "Yeah," I admitted, standing awkwardly near the doorway. He finally turned to face me, his sharp eyes studying me for a moment before he nodded toward the workbench. "If you're awake, you might as well be useful. Grab those planks and bring them over." I moved quickly, grateful for the distraction. The weight of the wood in my hands felt grounding, a tangible task that pulled me out of my head. As I set the planks down, my father gestured for me to sit. "Sometimes, the best way to deal with a restless night is to get your hands busy," he said, his voice steady, but not unkind. "The mind has a way of sorting itself out when the body's working." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or himself. Still, I picked up a chisel and started working on one of the smaller pieces of wood, the repetitive motion giving me a strange sense of calm. After a while, he stopped working and leaned against the bench, his expression thoughtful. "Kael," he said, his tone quieter than before. "I've been thinking about what happened at the market." I froze, my hands tightening on the chisel. "I don't want to talk about it." He shook his head. "You don't have to. But I'm not blind to what you're dealing with. And I know it's not easy. facing the world without powers in a place like this. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening as he walked over to a cabinet near the far wall. From within, he pulled out a long, wrapped object and set it on the bench between us. "I made this a long time ago," he said, carefully unwrapping the cloth to reveal a finely crafted staff. It was made of dark, polished wood with metal bands reinforcing its ends. Intricate carvings of flames and waves spiraled along its length, and the weight looked perfectly balanced. "It's a staff," he said simply. "Sturdy enough for walking, but strong enough for defense. The ends are weighted for striking if you ever need to protect yourself." He turned it over in his hands, revealing a hidden mechanism at one end. "And this, just in case." With a twist, a small, sharp blade slid out, gleaming in the light before he retracted it. "For emergencies." I stared at it, my throat tightening. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I want you to have something that's yours," he said firmly. "Something to remind you that strength doesn't always come from power. It comes from knowing who you are and being willing to stand your ground." I hesitated before reaching out, my fingers brushing against the smooth wood. It felt solid, reassuring in a way I couldn't put into words. "I don't know if I can—" "You don't have to know yet," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But when the time comes, you'll figure it out." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just nodded, gripping the staff tightly as he stepped back toward his work. The weight of it in my hands felt grounding, like I was holding more than just a tool. It was a promise, a connection, a step towards something I didn't fully understand yet. By the time I left the workshop, the sun was higher in the sky, and the village was beginning to stir. The staff rested firmly in my grip, and though the doubts were still there, they didn't feel as heavy. Today was a new day, and for the first time, I felt like I was starting to carry something worth holding on to.